Hello and welcome to the Knowledge Center interview here at Itron Utility Week on our first day in 2018. I'm joined now by Terrance Robinson, who's the Managing Partner, Energy and Utility Division at Verizon Wireless. Terrance, welcome. Thank you for making the time.
Thank you, Adam.
And it's probably good for you to get off your feet a little bit because you've been standing.
Absolutely.
Now, Terrance, tell us a little bit about the relationship between Verizon and Itron and how it's evolved and where you guys are now.
Okay, actually we've been working with Itron for well over 10 years. When you think about more traditional communications, if it's CNI, commercial and industrial metering, if it's AMI, also field area networking, we've been doing that for quite some time with several utilities across the country. So that's an area that is kind of tried and true, and really where you see Verizon playing, that's where you would expect. But what's really starting to become more exciting as utilities even continue to evolve and they start thinking about cloud, they're thinking about IoT, they're thinking about smart cities, and actually viewing cellular as being a viable component within that ecosystem. That's something that we're really excited about and where we're starting to see the relationship start to evolve and less the point solutions, which is what we've traditionally done.
So let's drill down into that cellular viability, for want of a better word, because there are a number of technology trends that are coming.
Right.
5G is being rolled out,
right,
or in places or enough. You also have power consumption at a different level than it used to be, maybe even 5 years ago. Can you tell us a little bit about what opportunity that provides you guys and, more importantly, the utilities?
Actually, that's a great question, because what we're seeing now, when you think about power consumption, that's a really big one for us. So now we have different categories. So when you think about LTE, there's different categories of modules. So we have modules that are embedded within your traditional smartphone, but then we have other modules that are really set up more for what we refer to as machine-to-machine or IoT types of communications, where it's not a human involved, it's actually different machines actually being able to communicate with one another. And so through having these different categories, we actually have different characteristics as to speeds, latency, and then also power consumption. So now what we're able to do, in the past, we really couldn't support, like, let's say gas metering or water, or at least support it in the way we would like to have, just because of the power consumption that the modules required. But now with these newer modules like Category M1, Category M, we actually now have the ability to support battery as the primary means of power, and as a result of that, we really can support that use case of doing digitized communications as it relates to metering at the gas level as well as at the water level, and that's something we're very excited about.
And when you look at that, how is the other narrative that's coming in where, maybe not now, but they're certainly looking at it, utilities are looking at more and more real-time communication, and there is still that view about, well, what network do I need to get real-time communication? You know, is the cellular network a viable option for that? Are you guys really looking at that or is it just part of a mix?
Yeah, it's really a mix. I mean, the one thing I always say is that it's going to be a converged effort. I mean, especially when you think about utilities, there are going to be certain elements, like let's say if there's aggressive polling cycles that are required, where something's very chatty, has to communicate a lot, it may not be ideal for cellular, but there's going to be many other instances, especially when you need a decent amount of bandwidth, where cellular is going to make a lot of sense. And that could be in real time, it could be in near real time, it could be obviously event driven. There's really a variety, but the exciting part of it is that cellular can really be there for all of the different use cases, but I definitely would say that having a converged network is truly the vision, just because there are some characteristics where proprietary infrastructure still does make sense.
And when you talk about that converged network, and you know, more and more, and you know, I hear this directly from people as well, where you know, people are like, "Hey, look, we're really great at the infrastructure side of things. You know, we know how to put in the wires and maintain them. We're great at that. But what you're now asking us to do is to become network experts, you know, and multi-node topology, mesh networks, all that sort of stuff.
Right.
How do you see companies like Verizon actually helping that deployment? Because it's one thing about giving the bandwidth, it's another thing about how you build that network topology? I mean, are you guys looking at that as a service as well? Or
yes, and actually that's a great point, because typically what we do see, when you think about a utility, they've stood up communication networks for years. They have expertise. But when you really compare it to a carrier, I mean, that's truly our core competency. So we have stood up actual professional services where we can build those networks and help them in regards to planning and some of those elements, because that's our core competency. That's something. And then also the security element of it is critical as well, which we're seeing, because when you think about it, on our backbone, roughly about 70% of the world's internet traffic traverses some type of infrastructure by Verizon. So even securing the network and being able to do that in an efficient way is something that we really have a right. We've earned a right in that space. So that's another area that we have been working even more diligently as it relates, because when you think about moving from electromechanical to IP, this is a big jump for utilities, and you're actually introducing more points of intrusion, really overall more risk within your infrastructure. So us being able to come in and provide some of that expertise.
And you guys have had that experience, haven't you? You've been through that whole switch towards an IP network. And
yes.
Do you think it's one of those like misconceptions when a powerful brand can be a challenge as well as an asset, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But they look at it and say, oh, it's a mobile entity.
Right.
You're really a network infrastructure company that can provide those services. When you look at the challenges that the utility sector is having, do you see them as being reasonably simple? The question I'm asking, is this industry overcomplicating stuff for the sake of it, or is it really as complex?
I'll put it to you this way. I think when you think about certain standards, and if you look at it from a standards perspective, I think there's ways we can standardize as an industry, but I will say that it is very complex in a sense that the topologies are similar when you look across different utilities, but there's a lot of complexities or nuances that are different in regards to how they're really approaching communications and just the overall topology. And that's part of the challenge, is that in other industries, you are a little more standardized, where you really can say, okay, this is what we should expect across the board. But with utilities, it's a little more unique in that way, is that you don't necessarily you almost have to deal with each utility as a one-off, but there are certain standards at a higher level that you can plan towards. And that's really what we've kind of focused on. And then we understand that there's going to be a lot of nuance that's going to go into that as well as it relates to infrastructure.
When you're talking about those standards, are you talking about technology standards? Because again, it's one of those things where I feel that, it's an irony, right? The more standardized you are, actually, the more you can innovate, as opposed to the other way around. So do you really, is this a really real thing within the utility sector, that they're not as standard-centric as, let's say, the telecom sector is? And
they're getting there, and we're seeing it with protocols. When you think of like DMP3, there's certain protocols that we know are pretty prevalent. And so we're seeing some of that as we continue to go forward. But even when we look at like the OEM space and you look at having cellular be prevalent, from an ecosystem across the board, these are all efforts that we're making progress. And interestingly enough, when you think about 3G, there was a lot, we were prevalent in so many different endpoints, and then flipping that to 4G. And then what's interesting, I think this is just something I'll throw out there because it's valuable for people to hear. They start thinking about 5G and they say, okay, well, guys, we just got to the point now where 4G has kind of replaced 3G. Now you're talking about 5G. But the distinct difference there is that 5G is it's not a replacement technology. It's going to complement what we're doing with 4G. So you think about how can we use spectrum in the most efficient way? How can we try to plan for overall network capacity? Those are the things that 5G are going to help us with, but 4G is going nowhere. 4G is going to continue to be prevalent as it relates to IoT, as it relates to mobility, and so we're going to continue to just kind of go down this path. We want to continue to try to enable as many devices from a public carrier connectivity perspective and continue just to make the networks more and more viable as it relates to us being able to partner and address real needs that we have for this sector moving forward.
Just in terms of 5G, I'd like to ask you this question because I've heard commentators say that 5G, you can either view it as a step to something else, or you can really look at it as a huge opportunity because there are things that 5G does that are out of this world, right? Some of the speeds that people are predicting down the road, maybe we aren't here yet, are phenomenal. In terms of the way you look at it, are there any of those things that come to your mind where you can say, 5G is going to enable X, Y, and Z in this potential?
Yeah, absolutely. And quickly on this, because I know we're a little tight on time. With 5G, as far as what it's going to be able to enable in the future, what we're really thinking about is the latency characteristics. Because a lot of people, they think about the bandwidth, because we're talking about gigabit speeds. I mean, that's incredible. But when you start talking about the latency, we're talking like sub 10 millisecond latency. So this starts to open the door. When you think about autonomous vehicles, you think about UAVs, all of these types of things. I mean, having that very low latency is going to be critical for making these things actually be viable in a commercial production type of setting. So we see the future is bright. A lot of it is based on the latency element of it. But the other thing I'll throw out there too is, and this is, I'm very excited to kind of talk about this, 5G is now. This isn't even us talking about the future. We launched in 4 markets. We launched in Sacramento, LA, Indianapolis, and Houston. And already now it's the initial use case is fixed. But we're talking about already being able to offer up to a gigabit speeds to consumers that they can take advantage of now. And this is something we're going to continue to evolve. And just lastly on that, and this is even on 4G, we're even doing some things with carrier aggregation where we're getting close to a gigabit speeds on a 4G network.
Wow.
So there's a lot that's going to happen with 4G. That's not going anywhere. And then we're really excited about 5G and what the future holds for us moving forward.
And just to finish off, that latency piece is critical about that towards this edge decision making, isn't it? Where
correct.
If people are going to do load shifting at the edge and so on, you really need that phenomenal speed, and it's the latency side of things.
Yeah, and that's really where the line kind of blurs between wireline, wireless. And so when we really look at 5G, we get to the point where you can say, hey, this could work in lieu of having a real fixed connection. And utilities are really still trying to wrap their minds around that because, what does that really mean? And then there's still some elements to it where we do want the applications to be built for optimal performance. But we're definitely in a place now where we can realistically start talking about wireless for virtually any use case, which is something we could have never said before.
Do you think there's still a fear factor where, again, as engineering businesses, they design for 7 nines reliability and so on? I mean, I remember having the conversation very early doors where people were talking about fixed mobile convergence or replacement, and people were saying, who would want to walk around with a phone where it drops out and then someone says, no, I'll call you back in 2 seconds, and then it works, right? But we are all doing it now. Well, is there a little bit of...
Well, I'll make one other statement that's kind of bold for a public carrier. We are looking at SLAs. So service level agreements, actually really moving into that arena, because that's what you see with traditional wireline networks. You have an SLA, you have guarantees of performance, and that's something that we're really looking at from 5G. And there's certain elements of that we actually can do with network slicing. There's parts that are actually inherent to the technology that would allow us to be able to do more from an SLA perspective and really give people that experience and really the reliability that they would expect.
Very quickly, is that a different way of procuring for a utility on an SLA-based thing? As opposed to...
Yes.
Okay.
That's a game changer. That's a game changer. Yes.
Well, wish you luck with that, Terrance.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you very much for joining us. On that note, we'll leave it. I hope you enjoyed this interview here at Itron Utility Week, the Knowledge Center 2018. Thank you for watching.